September 25, 1979, Via de Amicis, Palermo, Sicily. The Fiat 132 pulled away from the curb at 8:47 a.m. Inside sat Cesare Terranova, chief investigating magistrate of Palermo, and his bodyguard, Police Marshal Antonino Zucchetto. The morning was warm, the traffic light. Terranova carried a leather briefcase filled with case files, documents that mapped the structure of Cosa Nostra with a precision no Italian court had ever seen. He'd spent 30 years building that map. 30 years proving that the Mafia wasn't folklore or isolated violence, but a shadow government with its own laws, its own courts, its own executions. He had 3 blocks to live. At the corner of Via de Amicis and Piazza Generale Cascino, a motorcycle pulled alongside. The passenger raised a Kalashnikov-style rifle. The first burst shattered the driver's side window. Zucchetto's head snapped back. The second burst tore through Terranova's chest and throat. The car lurched forward, jumped the curb, and smashed into a parked vehicle. The motorcycle disappeared into the mid-morning traffic. By the time the ambulances arrived, both men were dead. Terranova's briefcase lay open on the blood-soaked seat. Papers scattered across the floorboards. Among them were files related to ongoing political corruption probes, documents that threatened powerful figures in the Corleonesi hierarchy, including Totò Riina, the successor to the man Terranova had spent 16 years fighting. Luciano Leggio, the boss of Corleone whom Terranova had finally succeeded in putting behind bars for life in 1975. This wasn't just murder, it was a declaration of war. The Corleonesi clan, led by Riina, had decided that the Italian state could be killed, one magistrate at a time, and Cesare Terranova, the judge who understood them better than anyone, was the first target that mattered. But to understand why they killed him, you have to understand what he knew. And what he knew began 2 decades earlier, in the ruins of a city being devoured by its own corruption. Act 1, the crucible of post-war Palermo. 1943 to 1950. Palermo, Sicily. Palermo emerged from World War II scarred but functioning. Allied bombs had flattened the port, collapsed entire blocks near the harbor, and left craters across the city center. By 1947, much of the city had returned to a fragile normality. Shops reopened, trams resumed service, neighborhoods rebuilt themselves with whatever materials could be scavenged. But pockets of destruction remained, and those ruins would become the foundation of something far worse than war damage. Sicily was hungry, broke, desperate, and into that desperation walked men who saw opportunity. The Christian Democracy Party, Democrazia Cristiana, or DC, swept into power on a wave of anti-communist sentiment, funded by Washington and backed by the Vatican. They promised reconstruction, jobs, modernization. What they delivered was collusion with the Mafia on a scale Sicily had never seen. Cesare Terranova was a young prosecutor in those years, watching the machinery of corruption assemble itself in plain sight. He understood early what most officials refused to admit. The Mafia wasn't a gang. It was a parallel state, and it was about to consolidate power through the one resource Sicily desperately needed: construction. 1950s, the groundwork. The money came from Italian national funds and regional development budgets, not foreign aid. Rome allocated millions of lire for Sicilian infrastructure: roads, housing projects, public buildings. On paper, it was legitimate investment. In practice, it was a license to steal. Contracts were awarded to shell companies owned by Mafia-connected families. Materials were bought at inflated prices from Mafia-controlled suppliers. Inspections were bypassed. Zoning laws were ignored. And at the center of it all was the building permit, a single sheet of paper that could turn a citrus grove into a concrete apartment block worth millions. The key was political access. The DC controlled Sicily's regional government, and the Mafia controlled the DC. Votes were delivered in exchange for public works contracts. Threats ensured compliance. Businesses that refused to pay protection burned. Union organizers who challenged Mafia control disappeared. Terranova documented everything. He compiled dossiers on construction firms, tracked cash flows, mapped connections between politicians and known mafiosi. But documentation wasn't enough. The courts required proof of criminal conspiracy, and proving conspiracy required witnesses willing to testify. In 1950 Sicily, those witnesses didn't exist. Fear was absolute. 1958 to 1965, the Sack of Palermo. The true destruction began under Mayor Salvo Lima, who took office in 1958. Lima was young, charismatic, and utterly corrupt. His administration, particularly through Public Works Councilor Vito Ciancimino, who held power from 1960 to 1964, became the engine of Palermo's transformation from a Mediterranean jewel into a concrete wasteland. Ciancimino's office was a permit factory. During his tenure, over 3,000 building permits were issued, many rubber-stamped without review, many for projects that violated every zoning regulation on the books. Historic buildings in the city center were left to decay deliberately. Repair permits were denied or delayed for years. When the structures became dangerously unstable, demolition permits were issued within days. The lots were sold to developers, Mafia front companies who built cheap, ugly apartment blocks and sold them at enormous profit. The strategy was partly driven by modernization ideology, a belief that old Palermo needed to be swept away and replaced with contemporary urban planning. But that ideology was exploited ruthlessly by corrupt officials and Mafia developers who saw profit in every demolished palazzo. Whether by design or opportunism, the result was the same: systematic destruction for private gain. Outside the city, the destruction was even more systematic. The Conca d'Oro, the Golden Shell, a fertile crescent of citrus groves that had surrounded Palermo for centuries, was bulldozed. Lemon and orange trees that had fed the city for generations were ripped out and replaced with shoddy concrete housing. By the mid-1960s, roughly 20 to 25% of the Conca d'Oro had been destroyed. By the mid-1970s, nearly half of it would be gone. The primary beneficiaries were Mafia families with construction interests: the Greco clan, the Salvo cousins, various front companies controlled by emerging bosses. Stefano Bontade, born in 1939, would rise to prominence later in the 1960s and 1970s, eventually controlling numerous construction shell companies. But in the late 1950s, the major players were the established powers, families who had spent decades building political connections and now watched those connections turn into gold. The water infrastructure was deliberately neglected. New apartment blocks were built without proper plumbing. Residents had to buy water from private trucks owned, of course, by Mafia-connected companies. This racket would grow throughout the 1960s and 1970s, a perfect example of how corruption created artificial scarcity and turned basic needs into extortion. Terranova watched the city he loved being devoured. He understood that this wasn't just theft, it was a demonstration of power. The Mafia and the DC were proving they could operate openly, without consequence, and that anyone who challenged them would be crushed. He also understood that the legal tools available to him were inadequate. Italian law in the 1950s didn't recognize the Mafia as an organization. Prosecutors had to prove individual crimes, murder, extortion, theft, but couldn't charge defendants with membership in a criminal enterprise. The Mafia exploited this ruthlessly. Bosses insulated themselves through layers of intermediaries. Orders were given verbally. Contracts were enforced through violence, but the violence was always deniable. Terranova began developing a new theory. If he could prove the existence of a hierarchical command structure, a cupola or commission, then he could charge the leadership with conspiracy. It would take years, and it would require a crisis so severe that the Italian state had no choice but to act. 1962 to 1963. The First Mafia War. The crisis arrived in blood. By the early 1960s, the Sicilian Mafia was fracturing. The construction boom had created enormous wealth, but wealth created competition. Drug trafficking, particularly heroin smuggled through Sicily to the United States, added another layer of tension. Different families controlled different pieces of the supply chain. Opium from Turkey, refineries in Sicily, distribution networks in America. The profits were staggering. The potential for betrayal was infinite. The Greco family of Ciaculli, led by Salvatore Ciaschitedu Greco, controlled much of the heroin trade. The La Barbera brothers, Salvatore and Angelo, wanted a larger share. Tensions escalated throughout 1962. Meetings failed, alliances shifted, and by early 1963, Palermo was a battlefield. The violence was brazen. Bosses were gunned down in cafes, bombed in their cars, ambushed outside their homes. The police struggled to keep up. Civilians died in crossfire. The Italian press, which had largely ignored mafia activity for decades, suddenly couldn't look away. June 30th, 1963, Ciaculli, Palermo. The breaking point came on a quiet residential street in Ciaculli, a suburb southeast of Palermo. A Giulietta sedan sat abandoned near a small villa. Neighbors reported it as suspicious. A squad of Carabinieri and Army bomb disposal experts arrived to investigate. The car was packed with explosives, a massive bomb triggered by a remote detonator. As the disposal team approached, someone pressed the button. The explosion was heard across the city. It killed 7 men instantly, 5 Carabinieri officers, 2 Army engineers. Body parts were scattered across a 100-meter radius. The blast shattered windows in nearby homes. A crater 6 feet deep marked the spot where the car had been. Italy erupted. The Ciaculli massacre wasn't just another gangland killing. It was mass murder of law enforcement officers, carried out with military precision. The government had no choice but to respond. Within weeks, thousands of Carabinieri and Army troops flooded Sicily. Roadblocks went up. Suspected mafiosi were arrested by the hundreds. And Cesare Terranova, now one of the most experienced anti-mafia prosecutors in Italy, was given extraordinary investigative powers and a mandate. Destroy Cosa Nostra's leadership. 1963 to 1965. The investigation. Terranova assembled a team: prosecutors, investigators, forensic accountants. They worked out of a secure building in Palermo, surrounded by armed guards, sleeping in shifts, knowing that every day they worked was a day closer to retaliation. The investigation was meticulous. Terranova understood that proving mafia membership required proving organizational structure. He needed to demonstrate that Cosa Nostra wasn't a collection of independent criminals, but a unified entity with a chain of command, a decision-making body, and enforceable internal rules. He began with the lowest level: soldiers and associates who'd been arrested during the dragnet. Some of them talked, not much, never enough for a full confession, but small pieces of information that could be cross-referenced, verified, built into a larger picture. A name here, a meeting location there, the description of a ritual, an oath, a hierarchy. Terranova traced the structure upward. Soldiers reported to capo regimes, captains who controlled crews. Captains reported to representatives who sat on the Cupola, the commission that governed all of Cosa Nostra in Palermo and beyond. And at the top were the bosses, men who controlled families, territories, rackets. He identified 117 defendants. The indictment, filed in 1967 after years of preparation, was a historic document, the first legal filing in Italian history to argue that the Mafia existed as a formal organization with a governing body. Terranova named the bosses he believed sat on the commission. He detailed their roles, their crimes, their connections to political figures and legitimate businesses. And at the center of his case was Luciano Leggio. Luciano Leggio, the Beast of Corleone. Leggio was born in 1925 in Corleone, a mountain town south of Palermo. He was brutal, cunning, and utterly without mercy. He'd risen through the ranks by killing his rivals, not in calculated hits, but in savage public executions designed to terrorize. He'd murdered the previous boss of Corleone, Michel Navarra, by ambushing him with a submachine gun on a country road in 1958. He'd killed union organizers, policemen, journalists, anyone who challenged his control. By the mid-1960s, Leggio controlled heroin trafficking through Corleone and had begun consolidating power across western Sicily. He was the embodiment of a new generation of mafiosi, younger, more violent, less concerned with the old codes of honor that supposedly governed Cosa Nostra. Terranova saw Leggio as the future of the Mafia, ruthless, strategic, and untouchable. Convicting him would prove that even the most powerful boss could be brought down by the law. The trial was scheduled for 1968 in Catanzaro, a city on the mainland far from Sicily's culture of intimidation. Act 2, The Great Challenge, Indictment and Judicial Failure. December 1968, Catanzaro, Calabria. The courthouse in Catanzaro was a fortress. Armed guards ringed the building. Every entrance was controlled. Spectators were searched. The defendants, 117 of them, sat in a massive cage-like enclosure in the center of the courtroom, a design meant to prevent escapes and attacks. The trial was a spectacle. Italy's most expensive defense attorneys represented the accused. Journalists packed the gallery. Terranova presented his case methodically, calling dozens of witnesses, submitting thousands of pages of financial records, phone logs, surveillance reports. The defendants were arrogant. Leggio, in particular, treated the proceedings as theater. He joked with his co-defendants. He smiled at the cameras. He gave interviews to sympathetic journalists, portraying himself as a simple shepherd being persecuted by an overreaching state. Terranova's case rested on two pillars: proving that Cosa Nostra existed as an organization, and proving that the defendants were members who had committed specific crimes under its authority. The first pillar was strong. Terranova's documentation of the commission structure was unprecedented. He demonstrated how decisions were made, how disputes were arbitrated, how violence was authorized. He showed that the Chiaculli bombing wasn't the act of rogue criminals, but an escalation in a war between organized factions. The second pillar was weaker. Italian law required direct evidence linking individual defendants to specific crimes. Witness testimony was inconsistent. Many witnesses recanted under pressure. Forensic evidence was limited, and the defense attorneys exploited every procedural weakness, every gap in the timeline, every ambiguity in the law. The trial dragged on for months. Terranova knew, even as he presented his closing arguments, that the outcome was uncertain. The judiciary was compromised. Judges faced threats. Families of court officials received anonymous warnings. And behind the scenes, political pressure mounted to avoid convictions that would expose the DC's complicity in Mafia crimes. December 22, 1969. The verdict. The judges delivered their ruling in a packed courtroom. Of the 117 defendants, only a handful received significant sentences. Most were acquitted outright. Leggio was convicted of criminal association, but the court ruled that the prosecution had failed to prove the existence of a unified mafia organization with hierarchical authority, the fundamental legal principle Terranova had built his case upon. The Court of Appeal's limited conviction was a hollow victory. In 1970, Italy's Supreme Court overturned even that, releasing Leggio due to insufficient evidence for the specific murder charges. The ruling effectively declared that the state could not legally prove the Mafia existed as an organization. Luciano Leggio walked free. Terranova sat motionless as the verdict was read. Years of work, thousands of hours of investigation, the most comprehensive anti-mafia prosecution in Italian history. And it had failed. Leggio's response was immortalized in the press. Asked about the verdict, he smiled and said it was a monument to Italian justice. The quote wasn't defiance, it was mockery. Leggio understood that the trial had proven the Mafia's impunity. The state could investigate, indict, and prosecute. But without political will and judicial courage, none of it mattered. Terranova's colleagues began dying. Prosecutors who'd worked on the case received death threats. Some transferred out of Sicily. Others simply stopped investigating mafia cases. The message was clear. The law couldn't protect you. Terranova refused to stop, but he understood that the courtroom alone wouldn't defeat Cosa Nostra. The fight would have to move to a different arena. 1974 to 1975. The second chance. 4 years after his acquittal, Luciano Leggio's freedom ended. In May 1974, he was arrested in Milan on new charges. Terranova, who had never stopped building cases against the Corleone boss, finally had the evidence he needed. Testimony linking Leggio directly to the 1958 murder of Michelle Navarra. This time, the case was airtight. Witnesses had been protected. Evidence had been corroborated. And in December 1975, an Italian court convicted Luciano Leggio of murder and sentenced him to life in prison. It was Terranova's greatest victory. The man who'd walked free in 1969, who'd mocked Italian justice, was finally behind bars, permanently. But Leggio's conviction came with a cost. The Corleonesi clan didn't forget, and they didn't forgive. Act 3. The political fight and the fatal return. 1972. Rome. Before Leggio's final conviction, Terranova had already shifted his strategy. In 1972, he left the judiciary and entered politics, running as a member of the Italian Communist Party, PCI. It was a radical move. Communists were still viewed with suspicion by much of Italy's establishment. But Terranova believed the judiciary had been compromised beyond repair. The only way to change the system was to change the laws. He won a seat in Parliament and immediately began using his position to publicly expose the connections between the Mafia and the DC. Parliamentary immunity protected him from libel suits, allowing him to name names: corrupt politicians, complicit judges, business leaders who laundered Mafia profits. He joined the Parliamentary Anti-Mafia Commission, a body created in the wake of the Tiaculi massacre, but largely ineffective due to political interference. Terranova used the commission to document what the courts couldn't prove: the systematic infiltration of Italy's political and economic institutions by Cosa Nostra. His work made him a national figure, but it also made him a target. The Mafia didn't fear parliamentarians, they owned too many of them. What they feared was a parliamentarian who understood their structure and had the courage to expose it. 1975 to 1979, the Corleonesi ascendancy. While Terranova fought in Rome, the Sicilian underworld was transforming. Luciano Leggio, now imprisoned for life, had groomed a successor before his arrest. Salvatore Riina, a killer even more ruthless than Leggio himself. Riina was born in Corleone in 1930. He'd murdered his first man at 19. By the 1970s, he was the operational boss of the Corleonesi clan, and his strategy was simple. Eliminate every rival, intimidate every witness, and dominate every racket in Sicily through overwhelming violence. The Second Mafia War began in the late 1970s as Riina moved to consolidate power. Rival bosses were assassinated. Entire families were wiped out. The old Palermo clans, families that had controlled the city for decades, were targeted systematically. Stefano Bontade, one of the most powerful bosses in Palermo and a key figure in the construction empire of the 1960s and 1970s, would be murdered in 1981. Salvatore Incirillo, another major boss, would die the same year. But before Riina could fully consolidate control, he needed to send a message to the state. We are untouchable. 1979, the return. In January 1979, Cesare Terranova made a decision that many of his colleagues considered suicidal. He resigned from Parliament and returned to Palermo, accepting the position of chief investigating magistrate. He was 62 years old. He knew the risks, but he also knew that the fight couldn't be won from Rome. Terranova returned to a city more dangerous than the one he'd left. The Second Mafia War was escalating. Bodies were found weekly, shot, strangled, dissolved in acid. The Corleonesi were hunting rivals and intimidating anyone who might cooperate with law enforcement. Terranova's return carried symbolic weight. He was the man who'd put Luciano Leggio behind bars for life. His successful prosecution in 1975 had proven that even the most powerful mafia boss could be defeated by the law. Now he was back to finish what he'd started, targeting the corrupt politicians and new generation of bosses who'd risen in Leggio's wake. He worked quickly, quietly, knowing that every day increased the risk. His office was under surveillance, not by the police, but by mafia spotters who tracked his movements, mapped his routines, identified vulnerabilities. Terranova was building cases against multiple targets. Political corruption investigations that threatened figures like Vito Ciancimino and the Salvo cousins, and criminal cases against rising Corleonesi leaders, including Riina. Each investigation was a threat to the empire the Mafia had built over 3 decades. The Corleonesi leadership met and made their decision. Terranova had to die. September 25, 1979, the execution. The hit was planned by Pino Greco, a Corleonesi killer known as Scarpuzzetta, Little Shoe. Greco was one of Riina's most trusted executioners, efficient, cold, precise. He'd killed dozens of men, many of them in broad daylight, and had never been caught. The ambush was simple. 2 men on a motorcycle, a Kalashnikov-style rifle, a route Terranova traveled every morning. The timing had to be perfect, public enough to send a message, quick enough to escape before police responded. At 8:47 a.m., the Fiat 132, carrying Terranova and his bodyguard, pulled away from Via de Amicis. The motorcycle followed, staying 1 car length back, waiting for the right moment. At the intersection with Piazza Generale Cascino, the traffic light turned red. Terranova's car slowed. The motorcycle accelerated. The passenger, later identified through witness testimony as a Corleonesi soldier, raised the automatic rifle and fired a sustained burst through the driver's side window. Marshal Antonino Zucchetto died instantly, his body slumping forward onto the wheel. The second burst hit Terranova in the chest, throat, and head. The car lurched forward, mounted the curb, and smashed into a parked Fiat 500. The motorcycle disappeared into traffic. By the time the first police car arrived 4 minutes later, both men were dead. Terranova's briefcase had spilled open. Case files covered the blood-soaked seats. Among them were documents related to ongoing political corruption probes, investigations that threatened the freedom of powerful figures in both the political establishment and the Corleonesi hierarchy. The scene was photographed, documented, analyzed. Dozens of witnesses were interviewed. Shell casings were recovered. Forensic teams examined the bullet trajectories, but no arrests were made. Not immediately, not for years. The killers knew they were untouchable. Conclusion: the immediate aftermath, September 26, 1979. Palermo. The news of Terranova's murder spread across Italy like a shockwave. He wasn't just another prosecutor, he was the prosecutor. The man who'd dedicated 30 years to fighting Cosa Nostra, who'd risked everything to prove the Mafia existed, who'd successfully imprisoned Luciano Leggio for life, who'd returned to Sicily knowing he might die. His funeral was held on September 28th in Palermo's cathedral. Thousands attended. Politicians gave speeches about justice and sacrifice. The press called him a martyr. But beneath the rhetoric was a darker truth. The state had failed to protect him, and his death proved that the Mafia could kill anyone, anywhere, without consequence. The Corleonesi didn't stop. Over the next 3 years, they would murder more than 1,000 people. Rival mafiosi, police officers, prosecutors, judges, journalists, politicians. The violence reached a crescendo in 1982 with the assassination of Pio La Torre, a communist parliamentarian and anti-mafia activist, and General Carlo Alberto Dalla Chiesa, the prefect of Palermo sent to restore order. Each murder was a declaration. The Mafia was stronger than the state. But Terranova's death also marked a turning point. His investigations, the files, the testimony, the organizational charts became the foundation for the next generation of prosecutors. Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino, two young magistrates who'd worked with Terranova, would pick up where he left off. They would use his methods, his documentation, his understanding of the Cupola to build the Maxi trial of 1986, a prosecution that would finally convict hundreds of mafiosi and dismantle much of Cosa Nostra's leadership. But that victory came at a cost. Falcone would be murdered in 1992, killed by a roadside bomb that used 500 kilograms of explosives. Borsellino would die 2 months later, blown apart by a car bomb outside his mother's house. The Mafia's message never changed. Challenge us, and you die. The legacy. Cesare Terranova's murder on September 25, 1979, was the beginning of the Mafia's war against the Italian state. It was a war the Mafia would ultimately lose, but not before claiming the lives of hundreds of men and women who refused to accept impunity as inevitable. Terranova understood something that most officials of his era couldn't grasp. The Mafia wasn't a criminal gang that could be defeated through traditional policing. It was a shadow state, a parallel government with its own laws, its own enforcement mechanisms, its own economy. Fighting it required more than arrests. It required dismantling the political and economic structures that allowed it to exist. He didn't live to see that dismantling. But his work, his investigations, his documentation, his refusal to surrender, and most importantly, his successful conviction of Luciano Leggio, made it possible. On September 25, 1979, a magistrate died on a quiet Palermo street. His briefcase spilled open, his files scattered across the blood-soaked seat. And in those files was the blueprint for the Mafia's eventual defeat. Cesare Terranova didn't just die fighting the Mafia. He showed the next generation how to win.